Okay, I'm Cornell Clayton. I'm director of the Foley Institute, and on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our event today. And before we begin, I just wanted to pause for a couple of reflections. First, as this is September 11th, I want to encourage all of us to take a quiet moment during the day and remember the nearly 3,000 individuals who lost their lives 24 years ago, and to honor all those who sacrificed in defense of democracy that day. The grief and the courage of that day must ever remain a part of our enduring national fabric. Secondly, because the Foley Institute is devoted to fostering constructive and civil political discourse, and because today's event in particular is part of a series on the future of liberal democracy in America, I must speak about the tragic killing of Charlie Kirk on a university campus in Utah yesterday. Kirk was a young, conservative activist who only recently spoke here at WSU. Whatever any of us thought about his politics, he championed the idea that democracy depends on persuasion, not intimidation, that opponents are to be debated, not destroyed. His death joins a troubling list of acts of political violence in recent years in our country, from the attempted assassination of presidential candidate Donald Trump to the brutal attack on Paul Pelosi, the husband of the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Violence from any side is the enemy of democracy. But violence doesn't arise in a vacuum. It grows in a culture that turns every political disagreement into a moral crusade. It vilifies those who we disagree with, and it feeds on inflammatory rhetoric and shuns honest debate. Each of us bears a responsibility to resist that culture. We can choose to speak with care, to listen to others with curiosity, and to remember that our political opponents are not our enemies, but our fellow citizens, fellow human beings, bound together in a common fate and in a common republic. So, having said that, let me now introduce this, our second lecture in our series on the future of liberal democracy in America. We are fortunate to have with us today Jeffrey Kopstein, who is the Dean's Professor of Political Science at the University of California at Irvine. Jeff received his PhD from UC Berkeley and formerly held faculty positions at Dartmouth, the University of Colorado, and the University of Toronto. Professor Kopstein's research interests include interethnic violence, anti-Semitism, and anti-liberal tendencies in civil societies. These topics are central to his two most recent books, Politics, Memory, Violence, The New Social Science of the Holocaust, which was published by Cornell University Press in 2023, and his second, which is the basis of this talk today, The Assault on the State, How the Global Attack on Modern Government Endangers Our Future, which was published by Polity just last year. Professor Kopstein's writings have also appeared in many popular outlets like The Atlantic, New York Times, and The Washington Post. So join me now in welcoming Jeffrey Kopstein to the Foley Institute.
Thank you, Cornell, for a gracious introduction. And I can only echo the comments made the lead up to that gracious introduction. One of my favorite books, actually, so I'll take 1 second to say, one of my favorite books is actually by a political scientist named Adam Jaworski, and it's called Paper Stones. And it refers to the history of electoral socialism. And the idea is that rather than using stones, we use paper. Right? We use the ballot, right? And since this is the same idea, the basis of our democracy is civil discussion and free and fair elections. And some of the things I'm going to talk about today. So this is the book that Steve Hansen and I wrote, and we've been co-authors for a long time. The joke that I usually make is the important thing is not that you read the book, but that you buy the book. So the origins of the project, that's Jeff and I. This is Steve sent me these slides. I'm not talking about myself. So Steve and I have been friends and colleagues for 4 decades. We went to grad school at Berkeley together. And the book really grew out of a COVID puzzle. We were all of us in this room were in exactly the same spot. we needed to have public health policies, but the one thing that happened, and we're not talking about whether you're pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine or social distancing or masks versus non-masks or whether we should be back at work or not back at work, but we couldn't agree on anything. We couldn't agree on anything. There was this, and it wasn't simply true just in strange places in the world, but in the United States and the UK, where you have this tradition of public service, impartial civil service, decent advice, public health institutions. People couldn't agree on anything. And so our thesis, as we were sitting there in front of our television sets throwing things at it, was that this was a symptom of a much larger assault on the modern state itself. Let me just go. Before I get to that next slide, in fact, today in the United States, public opinion shows that about 50% of the people in the United States believe there really is something called the deep state, right? Shadowy forces who secretly are pulling the strings behind the scenes, determining our lives, unelected, secretive, haughty bureaucrats doing things in underhanded ways. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is, where does this idea of the deep state actually come from? The strange thing is it doesn't come from the United States. So a small kind of genealogical excursus, if you will, for 1 minute, right? Where did it start from? The interesting thing is it starts in a car accident in Turkey in 1996, where the deputy head of the secret police was driving a car along with the head of the Turkish underworld, his girlfriend, and the head of the centrist party of Turkey. They were all killed, except for, I believe, the girlfriend wasn't killed. They was hit by a truck. And in the trunk, they found government-issued papers and guns and money and drugs. Now, it appears from all of this, there really was some sort of plot, and everybody knows this in Turkey, in order to use the mafia against the opponents of the military, Islamist and leftist opponents of the military. This idea of a deep state, it gained some currency in Turkey, and it's used all the time. It was eventually exported to other places in the Middle East, to Egypt, for example, where you had the same kinds of things going on. And then even to Islamist Iran, the same idea. But the strange thing is the idea then migrates to the United States, to the American left. Some of my old professors at Berkeley, not political science, more in the English departments than in political science. And the idea here is that it was really caught up with the military-industrial complex, right? The idea that the CIA is really, and the Pentagon and think tanks are pulling the strings in order to kind of keep power in the United States, to enslave us all. It wasn't long before the American right started picking up on this. And the idea there is that, yes, indeed, there are these unelected, secretive people, but rather than tools of American capitalism, they are tools of the kind of woke left. And the one to really use this with great effect was Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon who was, of course, Donald Trump's, became his campaign manager back in 2016. And the idea here is that it wasn't simply the deep state. Bannon started speaking of his desire to smash the administrative state. Now, the idea that those two things are used together, especially with a public law expert sitting here, right, is a bit of a strange thing, because the idea of the administrative state is we have these bureaucracies whose power is delegated from Congress, right, in order to do things. So not every single decision that every bureaucracy makes has to be a product of legislation. They have the rights to basically, because they have the expertise and the knowledge, they make these decisions, like the EPA or the FDA, right? But the idea in the American mind is that the deep state and the administrative state have been hopelessly conflated. So much for the genealogy of the deep state. Now, okay, so if there is this generalized attack upon the state itself, why should we care about the state? Like, who cares? And in order to understand that, you need to compare, right? Why is the modern state so special? Why is it important? The best way of understanding that is in order to understand what we had before. That is, the pre-modern state. We had pre-modern states of kings and queens, and they had administrations. They tended to rely on quacks, soothsayers, magicians, cronies, lots of friends and family. They weren't completely helpless. They were pretty good at using indiscriminate violence against their own people in order to sustain order. There was always order. And of course, they could attack their neighbors. There were wars. These states were not highly regulatory. They were not very good at capitalism. They were, as to quote a much older political scientist, Charles Lindblom, all thumbs and no fingers, right? They were very good at force. They were not very good at the subtle things that modern states do. And they're completely unable, which is why they went out of business for the most part, unable to handle the challenges of modernity. In the first place, modern war, which required professionalism, of course, regulating capitalism. But especially in modern times, what about the big challenges that we face? Global pandemics, to go back to the thing that we started with. Climate change, food safety, modern drugs. All of those things require a degree of expertise and specialization and merit-based hiring that could only exist with modern states. Okay, I'm painting with very broad brushstrokes here, and I'm happy to take all kinds of criticisms. So stay with me for a minute. Now, this attention that we're paying to the state, it is sort of a new thing. Most people today talk about a crisis of democracy, who are interested in these problems. There are tons and tons of books about how democracies die. My good friends Levitsky and Ziblatt at Harvard have written a best-selling book on how democracies die. Lots of books about the crisis of liberalism, the crisis of democracy. This dominance of the debate is really looking at politics as a set of two extremes, right? Either you have democracy on the one hand, or you have degrees of less democracy, less democracy, less democracy, until you get to dictatorship or authoritarianism. But we forget that dividing up the world into this way, into either democracies or dictatorships, was really a product of the post-World War II era and modernization theory, when we thought the rest of the world is going to eventually become liberal democracy. Inside of every Vietnamese is a little American trying to get out. It's from the Vietnam War, of course. But democracy versus autocracy, as important as it is, and I want to say I'm sort of worried about democracy too, and I know this series is worried about it, and of course I'm worried about it too, but I want to draw our attention to something else, because what democracy versus autocracy really brings our attention to, has us focus on, is the conditions under which leaders come to power. Do they win the free and fair election? The most basics, right? Elections aren't the only thing about democracies, but they're certainly, I can't think of a more important institution than the free and fair election. So they tell us about how leaders come to power, stay in power, but they really don't tell us very much about how rule is carried out. That is, you can have rule carried out pretty well by a non-democracy. Think about Singapore. You could have rule carried out pretty lousily by a democracy. Right? Think about Philippines. I'm going to come back to these examples in a few minutes. Which brings us to, in international relations, they say we don't know what the questions are, but we know what the questions are, but we're not sure what the answers are. In comparative politics, we say we're not sure what the questions are, but we're sure the answer is Max Weber. Max Weber, the great German sociologist, he said the key question is not elections. The key question is you can have a leader who comes to power either democratically or non-democratically. The question is why do people obey? Obedience is the key. After all, if you can't get obedience, a leader may come to power, pull the lever, and the lever's not attached to anything, right? Nobody's going to obey. So the key relationship for Weber was the relationship between the leader and the staff. Right? Every leader has to have a staff. For most of human history, the duty to obey, that is, why people obeyed the leader, why the staff obeyed the leader, it was based on a highly personalistic relationship. A highly personalistic relationship. You obeyed because out of respect, out of love, out of affection, and you weren't obeying the office so much as you were obeying the person. It could either be charismatic, think of Jesus, or Muhammad, or Moses, right? You could have that, but that doesn't last for very long. It was mostly kings and queens, and it was highly personalistic. If you want to see in the modern era, we have islands of traditional authority even in the modern era. And my favorite example of that is The Godfather, right? The Godfather, if everybody here has seen The Godfather, it's my favorite movie, right? The first scene, it's his daughter's wedding, right? It's his daughter's wedding. And the Don Corleone on that day has to take an audience and must grant people's requests. The undertaker, Buenasera, comes and sees him and says, my daughter's been raped. I want you to take care of the rapist, because they went on trial and they were let off with suspended sentence. What does that mean, suspended sentence? I want justice. And what does Don Corleone say back to him? He said, why don't you go to the police like you did? You never came over for a cup of coffee or kissed my ring or invited me to your house. You never wanted my friendship because it would be too scary. That moment is when Don Corleone says, you trusted the modern state, and the modern state didn't serve you. But if you would have relied on traditional authority, on friendship and respect, and what happens in the end, the undertaker says, be my friend, and he kisses his ring. And of course, presumably, Don Corleone takes care of the problem, right? I don't know what he does to the rapist. So this bond is emotional, for the most part. It's full of respect and friendship and devotion, and finding a staff is not easy. And so for the most part, in its purest form, this form of authority, Weber refers to as patrimonialism. Patrimonialism, that is the rule of the good father who looks at the state as a family business of sorts. As a family business. And under these conditions, you have a lot of friends and family working for you. And sometimes people do more than one job. Let's say, for example, they are, I'm just going to take something at random, like Secretary of State and National Security Advisor in one job, just to take one, totally random. Or a family member handles many portfolios. You see where I'm going with this, I mean. I'm going to really try to not be very political here, right? Because I want to try to be as analytical as I can be. So when you start to see things as I've started to told you here, you start to get, this is not in the book, by the way, this is for a political science crowd. All political science can be reduced to a 2x2 tape. This is a 2x2 tape. So you can have democratic and autocratic countries. That's the x-axis there. Or you could have, they could be ruled either bureaucratically, that is according to procedures, merit, the rule of law, or patrimonially, that is highly personalistically. And you can start to slot in countries. You know, this is a pretty crude slotting in, I grant you that. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm originally from Canada. So Denmark and Canada get coded there as both democratic and bureaucratic. That is, they are rulers come to power through a free and fair elections, and they're ruled according to a merit-based recruited bureaucracy on the basis of procedures. That is, when I go into the Department of Motor Vehicles, Nobody says, I don't like your last name. I don't like how you look. I'm treated like a number, like a unit. That's how I want to be treated. I don't want to be treated with a smile. Right? I want it to be cold and impersonal, an impersonal bureaucracy. So you have Canada. And then, of course, you can have countries that are both fully autocratic and patrimonial, that is run by persons. There you have, of course, Putin's Russia, Turkey under Erdogan, Hungary under Orban, and we can talk about how to code China. It's a tricky one, a very tricky one. The more interesting cases, of course, are in the diagonal. There you can, of course, you can have autocratic countries that are ruled pretty well. Singapore, most famously so since World War II. And of course, Max Weber himself based the idea of what he called legal rational authority on pre-World War I Germany, which was not democratic. That the whole idea that, if those of you who speak some German, as the Rechtsstaat, right, the legal state, comes out of Kaiserreich, that is Imperial Germany. Then you can have countries that are democratic, but their administrations are increasingly the plaything of the leader who views the state, as the family business. The Philippines is my favorite example. You have had free and fair election one after the other in the Philippines. So you had the Duterte clan, and then the Marcos clan comes to power. And of course, everybody who knows our age knows, of course, the Marcoses are a much older group.
I just want to point out, actually, there might be a better example of this, which would be Bangladesh. Until last year, it was basically the state was basically just like two women. I forgot their names,
Yes.
duking it out.
The interesting thing here, what I'm going to be talking about, is not that it occurs in the global south. It is not, right? Because that's where you would sort of expect it, because they never had traditions of legal rational states. The interesting thing is it's starting to occur in the global north. And of course, we have a highly ramified and highly articulated state in the United States that's built up as a process of accrual over a very long time. But the idea that the state can be viewed as growing out of the personal power and personal interests of the ruler is sort of new in the United States. And you have to understand, under a patrimonial system, the whole notion of corruption makes no sense. Corruption, the idea of corruption, that is the use of public office for private gain, that only makes sense under the rule of law. The word corruption means something different. It was used historically in patrimonial regimes. It usually meant the good father who stopped caring about his children. That was corrupt. Machiavelli uses it that way. Okay, you get where I'm going with this. This is pretty crude stuff because obviously Brazil and the United States, the Philippines aren't exactly the same, and Bangladesh, let alone Bangladesh. So where did this all come from? The standard explanation for within the literature says we got to look to authoritarian populism, and it's really the product. The literature really focuses on two things. One is rising inequality, the hollowing out of the middle class. We all know this story as a result of globalization, cheap Chinese goods, et cetera, et cetera. And so people want to correct that. The second explanation is changing demography as a result of immigration, increasing racial and gender equality, and the kind of cultural backlash that's produced as a result of that. That's standard in the literature. The public opinion data, it bears it out. That's the demand side for this. Why do people want the good daddy? Daddy. Remember, Tucker Carlson called him daddy. And the head of NATO, Rutte, called him daddy. And it's highly gendered. It's never women. The good father. It's not the good mother, for the most part. while most literature focuses on this demand side for these big changes for authoritarianism, Hansen and I don't think it's so much authoritarianism yet. I'm reserving my judgment on this. What about the supply side? What is the menu on offer? And the main solution to anti-liberal state building, after all, you're gonna have to have a state. Those are students who want to have anarchy either from the right or from the left. Nice, I was an anarchist for a week too when I went to Berkeley. Right? Away from home, you don't need the parents. Right? You're gonna have a state. The only question is what kind of state. And patrimonialism is, in our era, is now the modal solution to the problem of anti-liberal state building. Notice we're not talking about neo-patrimonialism, which is what the Latin Americanists talk about a lot. It is not the product of what went on in the global South. After all, you wouldn't expect to have a rule of law state in places that never had a rule of law state. The more interesting cases, as I'm going to talk about in a minute, are really those cases where you already had highly developed states, like the UK or the United States or Israel, right? So stay with me for a minute. This really starts, we argue, in Russia. What happens in Russia? Putin becomes the first guy to come up with the solution to the problem of anti-liberal state building. What is it about post-communist Russia? Hansen and I are both Sovietologists. I grew up speaking Russian. So, I mean, I've been there a lot of times. Let me go through Russia very quickly. Right after communism fell, there was this idea that what Russia really needed to do was to marketize its economy and to have elections. Once you're there, you're set. Free up prices, create private property, have decent functioning markets, and have elections. The problem with that is that it was a gigantic failure, right? For a whole boatload of reasons that I can get into afterwards, but it failed. Russia was chaotic. You produced huge inequalities. It was violent, and it was not very democratic. And so by the mid-1990s, the word democracy had been discredited in Russia. If you say, I don't know if anybody speaks Russian in here, but if you say in Russian, "Ya demokrat," I am a Democrat, that is an equivalent for saying I'm a thief. I'm a thief who likes to steal property. So Russia faced many of the same challenges as the United States and the West faced after 2008, after the financial crisis. You had a kind of increasing rust belt, hollowing out of the middle class, increasing economic inequality, and weak and unresponsive institutions, which produced the same kinds of "give us a daddy, please." So Putin comes to power and he reconstructs this state. In effect, he reconstructs a czarist, pre-Russian revolutionary state. And the first thing he does is he tries to export this closer to home. And it's not that hard to do because all of these other states around Russia had weak state traditions. And they could replicate, or they were offered to replicate, the Russian model. The one that he wants more than anything, but what Putin really wants, to make a long story short, he wants a world of Putins. He wants little mini Putins all around him. So you have Belarus. That is the best example. Belarus is ruled by former collective farm chairman Alexander Lukashenko, who pitches himself as the father of the country, likes to be depicted as, above all, as bringing in the harvest with young, beautiful women. It's really quite right. It's sort of comical. I'll skip over Azerbaijan. Chechnya is another it's a province of Russia, which was a breakaway for a while, but now is ruled by a Putin ally, a guy named Ramzan Kadyrov, who's a little mini Putin. And he rules quite viciously. It's like he's been known to feed his opponents to pet tigers. He's like a bad guy out of James Bond, right? And that was fairly easy to do closer to home. Harder was Ukraine. To make a long story short about Ukraine, is he offered this deal. Look, we don't want to take over Ukraine. We just want Ukraine to be basically a client state. Think of Don Corleone, to go back to the Godfather. He wanted the leader of Ukraine to be Fat Clemenza, right? To be the under captain. And Putin would be the capo di tutti capi, the head of heads, right? He didn't want to take it over. He didn't want to recreate the Soviet Union. Ukraine rejected it under Zelensky. And they were invaded for that reason. The more interesting cases, to get to the Bangladesh issue here, the more interesting cases about what happens in the rest of the world. Well, Viktor Orban's Hungary. Hungary, after communism fell, wanted to join the European Union. That was its most important task. Why? The European Union is rich. It's a single market. But to join the single market, the most important thing you had to do in the European Union was to build a regulatory state dictated from Brussels. What do I mean by that? You had to pass 88,000 pages of EU legislation into your own national legislation without asking, no questions. 10,000 regulations. And Hungary proceeds to try to do this. The EU is a state-building project. It's about building a regulatory state. And the first thing that Orban comes to power, well, he does a number of things. He comes to power and he says, yes, we want to be a member of the EU, but once they get into the EU, he says, we don't like this cultural stuff from the West. We don't like feminism. We don't like LGBTQ stuff. We don't like, racial equality. We don't want to have Muslim immigrants. We don't want to have any of that. So when the American conservatives started hearing that, they said, yeah, this is okay. And many of you don't remember this, but the Conservative Political Action Conference, that is the US Political Conservative Action Conference, held its annual meeting in Budapest. Now, I'm not sure that most of those people actually knew where Budapest was, but they held it there. And the big man himself, Orban, came and spoke, and he was interviewed by Tucker Carlson. It was a whole thing. And then the next year, they held the conference in Dallas, and Orban came over from Hungary and spoke. He says, we are a Christian nation. We are an illiberal democracy. So he started, but most importantly from my point here is he started attacking his own state. He attacked his civil service. He attacked the experts. He attacked the country's best university and kicked it out of the country, Central European University, which is not in Budapest anymore. Founded by Central European University, wait for it, George Soros, the Jewish, liberal, Hungarian, left-wing donor. And of course, Soros has become a boogeyman of the American right. But an attack on expertise in general, and of course, an attack on the judiciary, that came as well. Central European University, by the way, still exists. It's now in Vienna, Austria. Then it moved to places, so Hungary was post-communist. It didn't really have a big state to begin with, or at least a rule of law state. But you wouldn't have, maybe that wasn't such a surprise. And of course, Orban becomes also very good friends with Putin, by the way. Next, Israel. That's the more interesting case. And let me dwell on that for 1 minute. I've spent a lot of time, I teach every year. I used to teach every year. I haven't in a couple of years for the obvious reasons. At Hebrew universities. I know Israel pretty well. Israel under Netanyahu. Most people don't realize that historically speaking, the whole notion of stateness, right? That is in German, Staatlichkeit. There's a Hebrew equivalent. The Hebrew word for equivalent is mamlachtiut. And that precedes the founding of the state of Israel itself. They knew from the very beginning they had to create a state. They had to generate expertise. Hebrew University well precedes the founding of the state of Israel, while the British were still running the place. The state is at the core of the Zionist project, at its very core. It's the most important thing. What you probably don't know is that historically speaking, the corrupt party in Israel. The corrupt party, the anti-rule of law party, the party that opposed the creation of a constitution was in fact the left. It was labor. The right in Israel, the Likud, right, founded by Menachem Begin. Well, the preceder was Vladimir Jabotinsky, but once Israel exists by Menachem Begin, who becomes prime minister in 1977, they were the much more rule of law party. Bourgeois, they wore suits, ties. Right? The open collar actually is a very leftist thing in Israel. Who viewed themselves as institutionalists. And even when Begin comes to power, as the Likud comes to power for the first time in 1977, they do not attack the state. They leave it in place. So does Netanyahu. Netanyahu leaves it in place too when he comes to power. But by 2015, he starts attacking his own state, using exactly the same vocabulary as in the United States. And they use, not only that, but that the Federalist Society has an exact equivalent of it in Israel, right? I can get into what the Federalist Society is in Q&A. They even use the word in Hebrew, right? Sometimes they don't even translate it. They just transliterate it with Hebrew letters as deep state. Netanyahu attacked the civil servants, the experts, and of course, most famously, the judiciary, which we all sort of know about from the demonstrations. The price that was paid for that, interesting, there was a very interesting price to be paid for all of this, which prefaces where I'm going. After October 7th, and I don't want to get into, this is not a kind of an Israeli-Palestinian talk, which of course I could give as a separate talk. While the Israeli military did respond after October 7th, we all know about that, in the weeks afterwards, the state was a sort of a no-show. Most of the deputy heads of the ministries hadn't even been appointed. They'd been removed and never replaced. And so the people to really react first to what had happened at the front, right, were the people who were demonstrating in the streets in Tel Aviv against Netanyahu's government. And now in Israel, there's a huge discussion about the reconstruction of the civil service, totally separate from the issues of Gaza, right? Completely separately. I'm going to skip over the UK under Boris Johnson, another interesting case. How am I doing on time?
Oh, well, you got 20 minutes.
I'm going to finish in 3.
Okay.
I'm going to skip over the UK. No, needless to say, with Brexit, it was Brussels that was the deep state. Finally, the United States. I knew you were waiting for this. This book, which we had finished in spring of 2024, the thing I'm most proud of this book, and it's not most proud of, I mean, it's where we got sort of lucky, we predicted this thing called Project 2025. It didn't yet exist. We said, based on what had happened in the first term, we said, if it's consistent, something like that's going to happen. And we used this small thing called Schedule F. Schedule F was used at the end of the first Trump term to reclassify civil servants, senior civil servants, so they could be fired. They would lose their civil service protections. Biden gets rid of it immediately. It was at the very end. And Trump immediately brings it back afterwards. And then, of course, the creation of Doge, which, of course, we knew nothing about, which was designed to fulfill the project of 2025. So how do we know we're dealing with a patrimonial state? In the first place, it's the promotion of the extended household of the family, state positions. Second is concerted attacks on state officials and the judiciary as, quote, unelected bureaucrats in the league with shadowy forces. And the third, and this concerns universities, by the way, state universities, the subordination of experts and institutions of higher learning that might challenge the leaders' insights. Who's working at universities in here? We are state bureaucrats. That's what we are. We are experts. And one of the reasons we're not liked is we sometimes challenge the insights. I'm going to skip over that. And so what's the danger? The danger is we rely on the modern state. What would our world actually be like without it? Our air would be poisonous, our water would be undrinkable, our food would be inedible, our children would be educated by quacks, we wouldn't be collecting crucial economic statistics, we would be flying blind My favorite cartoon is a New Yorker cartoon with the passengers sitting on a plane. And one of the passengers stands up and looks at the other passengers and says, "Who do these smug pilots think they are? Let's fly the plane ourselves." We are now in the demolition phase, not just in the United States, but in other countries in the world. But what will replace it is not a leaner libertarian state. What will replace it is a repurposed patrimonial state. And there's no guarantee that just because we want our modern state, we'll be able to get it. And so for that reason, I'm going to skip over. Thank you very much for your attention to this matter.
We have about 15 minutes for some Q&A.
Yeah, happy to take questions, criticisms.
So maybe I'll start us off if nobody else wants
Please.
to. One of the things you talk a little bit about in your book, and I think is really fascinating, is the idea of meritocracy.
Yes.
And Michael Sandel and others have written, I think, very persuasively that
Yes.
one of our problems right now is a meritocracy that's created social status problems. So why don't you say a little bit about that, how you see meritocracy fitting into this?
So the basis of our modern state is recruitment to institutions of higher learning, Washington State, and ultimately into the government on the basis of merit. Merit as usually as judged by exams, by grades, by the peer evaluation of others. Sandel and others have pointed out that this leads to a replication of the already existing elites, right? And you don't have enough of a circulation elite. So the solutions to that, and so I don't have a problem with that criticism. It's an excellent criticism. The solution to that, however, is usually posed as either having, let's say, a lottery for getting into Harvard. I see, yeah, you just cracked a smile, right? And that's, I cracked a smile too, like things that aren't going to happen, right? It's getting into the University of Californians and getting into Washington State universities, right? That's really the issue. And I don't see the proposed solutions as being implementable enough with enough alacrity to actually be practical. I think the problem is that we need to actually, I'm very old fashioned, and Steve would agree with me. We need to give people the tools that they need. We're very old fashioned in that sense, in order to succeed, in order to enter the elite, right? Maybe things have changed. My grandfather was born on a dirt floor. Neither of my parents went to college. It is possible. I mean, as I was saying to Richard before, I go home on the weekend to visit my 92-year-old dad, and I sit and read a book on the sofa, and he looks at me, he goes, "Jeff, I thought you were going to be working this weekend." I said, "That's the job, right?" So what I'm saying is that it's not that the pathology that they put their finger on, it's true. I just think the proposed solutions, when I gave this talk at Harvard, the same question came up. Sandel wasn't there, but Theta Skocpol was the commentator, right? And when she heard it, she sort of laughed. When she said, "Michael Sandel said that," right? And so that we should go to some kind of lottery. I'm not against experimentation.
A lottery of the qualified is what he said, so.
Yeah, of course, right? No, and I'm not against experimentation. I think as a general principle, though, we have to have a set of procedures for making sure the best people qualified for the job get in. And I don't want to get rid of that. I think that would be throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Yes, please. And one, too. Yeah, yes.
You mentioned the Federalist Society earlier, and I'm
Yes.
wondering your opinion on the relationship between the patrimonial state and the Federalist Society.
Yeah. So in virtually everywhere in the world, there's a three-part sort of coalition for the attack on the state. It's a strange coalition. On the one hand, you have libertarians, right? Nice venerable tradition of people who say, look, any amount of state, eventually there's a kind of a creeping authoritarianism that comes from that. They take more and more of our freedom away, and the state becomes more and more powerful. So they usually advocate for a kind of a minimal state. So that's one part of the coalition. And it goes, from Ayn Rand, Hayek, von Mises, all these kind of smart people, right? With a critique of the state. And believe me, as a kind of a former Sovietologist, I buy that part of that critique. There's a second part of this coalition. The second part of the coalition, who also doesn't like the existing administrative state, and that is what we might call Christian nationalists. And the Christian nationalists don't like it for a couple of reasons. One is that they view the administrative state as pushing religion out of the public sphere, which it sometimes does. Or that it's disproportionately benefited because it's Christian nationalism, remember, it's disproportionately benefited non-white groups in the society and, of course, non-male groups in the society. So one of their biggest critiques is about the legislation and gender equality, and especially administrative rulings along these lines. So that's number two. Number three are those who believe that the state would work well if we just had a really powerful president. That is unitary executive theory. That is the idea that the president and the president alone controls the executive. The problem is, there's a couple of problems with this. One is they disagree with each other, right? The big thing is they disagree with, think about it for a moment. If you had an all-power executive, and it would be one thing if you were, let's say, a Christian nationalist and you had a Christian ruler, a Christian national ruler. What if you had an all-power executive who just happened to be Bernie Sanders? You would have, arguably, they don't agree among themselves. Not to mention, of course, the libertarians, who ostensibly, philosophically at any rate, shouldn't have a problem with abortion or smoking dope or whatever. Anybody who's ever been to a Republican convention, as I have, just as an observer, we'll see that there are these different groups who don't necessarily agree with each other. The one thing they do agree on is with this leader, all of them will get something. And so the kind of focal compromise point is the patrimonial ruler, who will give each group. Now, what's interesting is in the Federalist Society is key in that, not completely key, because the Federalist Society is a pretty broad set of views, and some of them are sort of interesting. But I'm painting with broad brushstrokes here. The interesting thing in Israel, you have exactly the same thing. You have the Kohelet Forum, which is exactly the same as the Federalist Society. They believe in, Bibi, who started off, Netanyahu started off as a kind of free marketeer, right? They also push Jewish nationalism, not Christian nationalism, but it's the same idea, right? The role of religion in the public sphere and the kind of clearly stated dominance of the Jewish group, which in a national state, I guess, is not so bad, but they're not only, it's not only Jews who live there. And of course, the unitary executive, which is all about disempowering the judges, right? Israeli law over the last 40 years has become, highly, their constitutional court has become highly activist. It's very American in that sense. And it's all about disempowering it, right? Resubordinating it to executive power. So that's the sort of coalition. And I think the Federalist Society is one of the sweet spots for that. And they've been willing to, both at the Christian national side, at the unitary executive side, certainly, those are the rulings we're seeing, right? And also the libertarian side, against the regulation. It also happens to coincide with, the kind of hostility towards the regulation of energy industries, et cetera, right? So, I think that's the kind of short and sweet answer to your question. Yes.
I'm loving all the doom and gloom.
Yeah, I know. This is book's a bit of a downer. The next one I have to, write about, rainbows and unicorns or something.
That's what I'm asking for here.
Yes.
So how have institutions of higher education and experts pushed back in the past, breaking the cycle of patrimonialism? Were they successful, and have any been?
Well, that's the thing. It's a great question, and you're asking for a solution. The thing is that Weber predicted many things. He never predicted a return of patrimonialism. This is the thing, social theoretically, we're on new ground here, right? That the idea that this would be gone for good. I mean, after all, these leaders did run their societies pretty poorly, right? I think one of the weak spots is incompetence. We shall see. And corruption. Now that's dependent upon the continued public acceptance of the definition of corruption, of the use of public office for private gain. In hypothetical countries, you could achieve a point at which somebody said, yeah, the leader's using the office for public gain, but he's basically doing a pretty good job, and my life is better than it was before. And they deserve a little bit. And Putin does say that to his own people when they come into him, and he'll say, our salaries aren't high enough, and he'll say, why aren't you using it? Using your office for private gain. That's how you know you're in a fully consolidated patrimonial regime.
I am from the Philippines, by the way.
Bingo. All right. So, I mean, how do we get out of this? One is, clearly we need a revalorization of public service. There's a lot of this, the whole idea of, the bureaucracy, it is the kind of brunt of jokes. It is the kind of mother-in-law jokes of the 21st century. Not that there's anything wrong with mother-in-laws, in case she's watching. I don't know how many of you, because a lot of the times the discussion is the private sector works better. And I don't have a problem with that, by the way. Sometimes it does work better. I'm not saying that the whole world should be run like the Department of Motor Vehicles. Not that there's anything wrong with the Department of Motor Vehicles. But when's the last, I just had, as Richard knows, I just had some pretty, not major surgery, I had surgery, right? And the bills are starting to come in. Now, I'm insured, I have good insurance, but they still send you the bills and you don't know how much is yours and what's the deductible and all that kind of stuff. I can't read these bills. This is the private sector. When's the last time you've dealt with a call center for a lost bag on an airplane? Private sector. Your car being fixed. Social Security. That's more public. But the private sector, I'd say, has a lot of it's time that we point the finger in the other direction and valorize most people who go to work for the state, whether at the state of Washington or the state in the United States, in Washington, D.C. or California. They do so because they want lives of public service. They're not greedy bureaucrats or lazy bureaucrats. It's not to say that we shouldn't change the rules to make it easier to hire and fire. Civil service reform, fine. Or argue about high taxes versus low taxes. Fine. Steve and I don't even agree on all this stuff. The question is, are we going to have a modern state? Michael Lewis, the guy who wrote Moneyball, right? He has a new edited volume, which you never say like a guy who's a best-selling author. He has a new edited volume. I can't remember its name. It's really good. It's basically a series of vignettes, true stories about ordinary government bureaucrats, ordinary government workers, what they do on a daily basis, how they keep us safe, healthy, and wealthy, and strong. Remember, you can be right-wing here on my point. You still need to have a professionally well-working military. Would you not agree? So that's sort of one of my answers. It involves a sort of cultural shift, and the idea of this book is to contribute to that cultural rethinking of the role of the modern state. I'll leave aside the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
So we have time for one quick last question.
Sure.
This is actually a clarification from a slider. I'm not sure if you said you would cover it later, but before you went, I wanted to have you clarify on that. In that like graph with all the countries,
2 by 2, yeah.
yeah, why was what was up the question mark?
Oh, yeah, so let's go back to it really quickly. Okay. So China is a very interesting case. China has been able, over the last 30, 40 years, to take its communist-ruled bureaucracy and to have it preside over, in a fairly even-handed way, capitalist development. Building public goods. I've only been to China once. Anybody who's been to China and has seen the speed at which they build high-speed rails, their government actually does stuff, right? It provides public goods. That's what we want government to do. That's what we want government to be. We want government without the modern government, I'd make 2 predictions. One is you get a slow deterioration of infrastructure. The whole world will look like LAX. In LA lately. But the other thing we want government for, that's why the COVID example was so important at the beginning, we want it as a hedge against catastrophe. What about the next? I mean, let's face it, when we were being told to drink bleach, you all remember that moment, don't you? Right? When kerplunk, my beer can popped off the television, and the expert was sitting at the side. The expert, the appointed expert, was sitting at the side turning red. We've all been in that position before when a blowhard is up there and you slide under the table. When the person's out of their zone of comfort and they start freelancing. China, until now, for these last 30 or 40 years, has had a relatively it took its communist bureaucracy and turned it into a modern state. It's starting to change. Xi has become a patrimonial ruler. He's taken off all rules surrounding himself, including their own term limits. He's reintroduced the mandatory study of Xi Jinping thought. Sound familiar? And so, of course, what follows from this, the reason the question mark is because, like all scholars, we're not completely sure. We're not completely sure. But if Xi is attacking his own modern state, then it will justifiably fit in that category as a dictatorial and patrimonial regime. I hope I'm being clear. So thanks so much.
Okay. Unfortunately, our time is up. Before we thank our guests, let me remind you, we have another lecture in this series next week. On Tuesday, we have Secretary of State Steve Hobbs is going to come talk about the importance of free and fair elections in a democracy. So I hope you come and join us then, same time, same place, but Tuesday, not Thursday next week. Now, join me in thanking Jeff Kopstein for a really